is the nature of things. London, Ontario, 1999. A young man with schizophrenia waits for a brain scan. He's part of a research study.
Because of the effects of the medication that was given to him, he was a little bit restless, and he did go out to have a breath of fresh air and take a little walk. Later, that we results, there was something very unusual about this scan.
The scan shows a dramatic jump in the brain chemical dopamine.
So the following week when he came back, I probed him a little bit more.
The subject admits he'd wanted to relax a bit.
He smoked cannabis on the day of the experiment, just prior to the brain scan.
Part science, part fluke. The brain scan is the first physical evidence of a link between marijuana and schizophrenia. We call it pot, weed, or dope. It's all marijuana. And for many people, smoking it is simply a way to unwind, not a big deal. But for others, it can be a very big deal. There's new evidence it can contribute to mental illness, and some of our teenagers are most at risk. The chemical filling this bag is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, the active ingredient in marijuana.
Je kunt, zodra je tegen het mondstuk aandoet, hou hem tegen je mond, adem hem goed in, dus 3 tot 4 keer.
In the service of science, 30 Dutch citizens are getting high.
We are the first to actually expose patients with schizophrenia to THC and then have them take a PET scan. So we're really excited.
Across North America, researchers are interviewing hundreds of adolescents, searching for early signs of schizophrenia. All are asked about their drug use, any drug use.
Not even just a little bit of pot or anything like that?
No.
For most people, marijuana offers a pleasant buzz, but it will send some into a state of paranoia, and sometimes even psychosis. Psychosis is a temporary but frightening state, filled with intense anxiety and hallucinations. It's a symptom of schizophrenia. One of the first to suggest a possible connection between pot and schizophrenia was London journalist Marjorie Wallace. Today, she heads an organization called SANE that fights on behalf of the United Kingdom's mentally ill. But in the mid-'80s, Wallace was an investigative reporter for the Times of London. Her research for a series about schizophrenia revealed a troubling constant.
A lot of the times, when I interviewed the families or the person themselves with mental illness, the word cannabis or marijuana came in. They would come to me and they would say, you know, that the room is filled with the stub ends of cannabis, that they believed that the person that they knew, this sort of young daughter or this young son, was a different person before they took it, and that it somehow changed their personality.
At the same time, Dr. Robin Murray, one of the world's leading experts on schizophrenia, was confronting the same question.
Lots of parents and relatives of people with schizophrenia kept asking me, could the schizophrenia have anything to do with all the dope that they took? And at first I used to say, well, I don't think it could be that this could be the case. But I heard so many relatives say this that gradually I became interested in the question of could it be true?
Could it be true? Murray found the first strong evidence in a Swedish research paper.
There was a famous paper by Albeck and Andreasen in 1987, and that was in The Lancet. And of course, this was a very good paper, so it made us think.
The study followed a group of 50,000 Swedish military recruits over 15 years. It found a direct connection between schizophrenia and marijuana use.
The more cannabis that people had taken when they were 18, then the more likely they were to be admitted to hospital and be diagnosed as having schizophrenia over the next 15 years. So if you were a heavy smoker of cannabis at age 18, you were 6 times more likely to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia than if you didn't take any cannabis at all. So that was quite a big effect.
A former student of Murray's, Dutch researcher Jim Van Os, had also begun to notice a link between schizophrenia and marijuana use.
By the mid-80s, we started to observe that really the majority of patients coming in with the first episode of psychosis had been using cannabis, I think about 80–85%. The Swedish cohort study was actually the first that got widespread attention.
But it was just one study. Could it be replicated? While new studies were being launched, marijuana use in the Western world rose dramatically. Through the 1990s, use doubled in Canada and the United States. It took 15 years, but finally the new wave of studies came out, and they supported most of the Swedish findings. Then Van Os, now one of the world's leading epidemiologists in the area of schizophrenia and marijuana use, took all the findings of all the studies, discarded any doubtful statistics, and dealt with only the most conclusive evidence. His result was more conservative, but definitive.
We found that cannabis actually nearly doubles the risk of developing future psychotic states, be it isolated psychotic symptoms or clinical psychotic disorder like schizophrenia.
And if kids begin smoking pot before the age of 16, they're particularly vulnerable. The studies show their chances of developing schizophrenia don't just double, they could actually quadruple.
Very first time I had a marijuana joint was in grade 9. I couldn't find anything wrong with it on the internet, so I tried it and it didn't do much the first time. Then the second time I tried it, I don't know, I loved it. I was hooked. I was smoking constantly.
When I first found out that he was smoking pot, I was aware that he was, and I was upset about it. I phoned the hotline for drugs, and I was told not to overreact. It wasn't really a big deal. Lots of people grew up doing it in the 60s and 70s.
It got a lot worse really quick. Eventually, I'd smoke it, and I'd just sit there in pain, and I'd just hear things coming at me, like all these voices, and yeah, it was terrible.
He was watching TV one day, and then he was saying that they were communicating through the TV, and then he actually collapsed on the floor, and I phoned 911, and I put his head on my lap, and we just waited for the ambulance to get here. I saw within a 6-month period of time, I lost my son. Anything that he enjoyed doing, all his sports, stuff like that, he couldn't do anymore, because whatever he enjoyed seemed to be robbed away from him with hallucinating or voices.
Doctors have struggled to come up with a diagnosis for Tyler, but most of them are variations on schizophrenia. Tyler was in and out of hospitals for 3 years in an ongoing battle to control his illness.
I was about 19 years old. My friends were basically telling me that it wasn't even a drug. It was more like a organic thing that's been made by nature that will help make you relax. I became a frequent user after, so I was hooked after the first time. I was with some friends. and I went to the Amsterdam Cafe for the first time. I was given some weed from a vaporizer machine. I got so high that night that I actually became manic and became out of reality and ended up in the hospital. I thought people were gonna eat me. At one point I thought I was in the military. One point I thought I was in like a time zone that didn't exist.
Melanie was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a mental illness characterized by large mood swings and, in her case, psychosis. She was hospitalized for 3 months.
I started smoking marijuana when I was about 15. I started smoking it because I wanted to see how it transforms you. Whenever you smoke pot, your psyche shifts from one place to another place. So it's quite a transformation of self.
The school grades were just dropping out of sight. He was starting to cut class. My sense was I wasn't able to connect with him, that he just quite wasn't there, wasn't present.
I would get all of these like illusions, and I would actually believe it. Like, I thought that there was an exorcist demon in my house.
I heard him shouting and screaming, and I went downstairs and he was slamming his fist against the wall, and he was shouting at the television that the TV, he thought it was giving him voices, and he was trying to write the messages down on little cards and bits of paper. And I knew that we were probably looking at schizophrenia. You have this boy who you absolutely adore, and well, like all of us, we grow up wanting our children to live rich and wonderful lives. And the more I started to read about schizophrenia, the more terrified I got.
After years of heavy marijuana use, Ben was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He spent over a year in a psychiatric hospital. Ben, Melanie, and Tyler, and their doctors believed their illnesses were triggered by marijuana. THC, the hallucinogen in marijuana, triggers an increase in dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a brain chemical that controls mood, and an increase in dopamine makes us more aware. That heightened awareness can lead to the hallucinations associated with schizophrenia.
We developed a test where we have people listen to white noise. And even though there are not any voices, it's just white noise, some people will report that they hear a voice in the noise. Psychosis really is about a tendency to attribute too much meaning to neutral and mundane events. That in circumstances of stress, the things that are normally mundane and neutral all of a sudden can take on a special significance. So they have a tendency to make up meaning where there isn't any.
Too much THC in the brain circuits can potentially trigger that same heightened awareness and misplaced meaning. So just how much THC are Canadian pot smokers inhaling? Health Canada tests the strength of pot confiscated from illegal grow-ops and reports back to the RCMP.
The THC levels that we see today are much greater than the 60s and the 70s, where people say, well, you know what, it took the edge off and it helped me get through university, or where the case may be. That was THC levels of 1 to 3%. And we know today that what's coming out of our labs is THC anywhere from 18 to 23 to 25%. And that is significant.
Health Canada statistics show the average THC content in marijuana seized from grow-ops has increased more than 130% in the last 10 years. And that kind of dramatic increase isn't restricted to Canada.
In the newer forms, as particularly the Dutch and I have to say the British Columbians got good at re-engineering the plant and developing particular potent types of cannabis, what they did was to drive up the THC content, and this may reach 16, 18, 20% now in the UK.
You're not dealing with the sort of more innocent hippies 60s drug. Now we have a very different substance.
Today's marijuana is so potent, the United Nations has discussed classifying it as a different drug from the 1960s product. Yet most people who smoke pot can use even the stronger varieties with no bad effects.
The vast majority of us drink alcohol, the vast majority of us come to no harm. Same with cannabis. The vast majority of people who take cannabis have nothing but enjoyment from it.
So why does it have a crippling effect on some teens? Could these brain scans divulge the secret of how pot triggers schizophrenia? Marijuana is the most widely used illegal drug in the world, and its potency has increased enormously in the last 20 years. So it's alarming that smoking pot before the age of 16 could quadruple a teen's chances of becoming schizophrenic. But marijuana cannot trigger mental illness on its own.
We all vary in our genetic susceptibility. Some of us can happily take cannabis and not develop a problem. Others of us are more prone. So there are these background factors. If you have what we would call a psychosis-prone personality, you have eccentric ideas that you perhaps are not good at relating to other people, people with that type of personality.
He was always artistic, you know, a dreamer, thinking his own thoughts, somewhat detached from the group on the whole. And that was noted by other teachers, particularly in sports. You didn't see him really getting what sports was about.
You're also more likely to experience a psychotic disorder if there's a family history of psychosis. And there is history in Ben's family.
I have a nephew once removed who developed bipolar. His uncle also had what looked like a schizophrenic break when he was in his 20s, but made a full recovery.
So how's your day going?
Pretty good.
I believe my father had a mental illness. It was undiagnosed, and the symptoms weren't the same as Tyler's.
So there may have been mental illness in Tyler's family as well. There are other risk factors: using upper drugs like cocaine or crystal meth, experiencing childhood trauma, even where you live plays a role. Schizophrenia rates are higher in urban areas. Unraveling how marijuana interacts with all those risk factors is enormously complicated. Researchers hope to solve that puzzle by looking directly into the brain after schizophrenics smoke pot. The city of Maastricht sits in the southeast corner of the Netherlands, close to Belgium, France, and Germany. So it's a popular spot for what's called cannabis tourism. Maastricht has 13 cafes where you can legally purchase up to 5 grams of your favorite marijuana. Mark Jostman owns a coffee shop by the river.
You come into the coffee shop, and then there's a menu list where you can buy cannabis. You can consume cannabis products in the coffee shop, but also you can just drink a nice cup of coffee or tea or have a sandwich, whatever you prefer.
In a country where it's legal to serve marijuana in coffee shops, it's easier to conduct experiments using the drug. At the University of Maastricht, Jim Van Os has been using population studies to show a connection between marijuana and schizophrenia. But now he needs hard biological data.
It resembles a bit the debate about tobacco and lung cancer, because for a long time the tobacco companies would say, well, you know, there's epidemiological evidence, but that there's no causality because you haven't got a biological mechanism that can explain the findings. So I think with cannabis it's going to be the same thing. We need to have a better idea about the biological mechanisms underlying the relationship between cannabis and psychosis.
So Van Os and his colleagues are now doing on purpose what happened by accident back in 1999. They're scanning the brains of pot-smoking schizophrenics. Cecile Henquet heads a study at the University Hospital that will track marijuana's effects on dopamine.
Dopamine plays an important role in the development of the positive symptoms of psychosis, such as hearing voices or feeling very paranoid.
The subject's brains are first scanned for a baseline measurement. Then a vaporizer is used to administer THC, or a placebo, to a group split between healthy participants and subjects with schizophrenia.
The dose we're using at the moment sort of follows the dose that people use when they use cannabis recreationally. So they feel a bit high, but not too much to make them too anxious or too psychotic.
After the vaporizer, it's into the scanner a second time. While the brain is scanned, the subjects are given cognitive tests.
Nou, dat is gelijk een test, want dat hebben we nog nooit getest.
What we actually want to do is to link this biological mechanism, so probably this increase in dopamine, to the psychotic experiences people may have when they have used cannabis. And, well, you can ask people, do you feel psychotic now at the moment? But you can also use questionnaires for that.
Early study results show THC did trigger psychosis, but the link with increased dopamine remains elusive. Showing that pot drives up dopamine levels would only partly explain what marijuana does to the brain. Researchers suspect any damaging effects happen when the THC in marijuana interacts with something called the cannabinoid system, a little-known family of brain chemicals and receptors. This system is critical to how we process the world around us. Our body's own cannabinoids attach to receptors on the brain's nerve cells. There, they regulate